Well, Ms. Cox, why don't you talk about growing up in this area, and I think you said Old Alabama Road, that area?
Correct.
Why don't you talk a little bit about what that was like?
Well, it was a very quiet town. It was a rural area, dirt road. Mm-hmm. There were only, the Hunt Road did a dead end into Old Alabama Road, which went all the way to Woodstock at that time. And it was all dirt. And there was only 1, 2, 3, 4, I think there were 5 houses on that stretch of road, which was about probably 2 miles.
Wow.
There weren't, wasn't anything like what it is now. And Lamar's family, the Hunts, lived at the end of the road. Mm-hmm. We did not have any street number. We didn't have any house numbers. We didn't have any street. There was no street. It was just a road, mm-hmm. and it was Old Alabama Road, RFD. Mm-hmm. And then later on, I guess people started moving in, and they had a Route 1 and a Route 2. Then later on, it became we didn't have a zip code. Mm-hmm. And then we later got a zip code, and it was split like Acworth on the other side of the railroad tracks. I don't know what direction it would really be, but we lived on the north side, I guess the west side of the tracks. Of the tracks, yeah. And they'd always tease us and say, "Oh, you live on the wrong side of the tracks." But it was rather quiet, not anything like it is today. We did not have a telephone. We did not have electricity. Mm. And, that came later. And the first telephone numbers we had were Webster, W-E, with 4 numbers. Do you remember when you got electricity? I was probably about, I was about 4 years old when we moved to the house where my mom and dad bought on Old Alabama Road. They bought 40 acres, more or less, mm-hmm. And they bought it from Mr. Jonas Priest, and it was $800.
Wow.
It sold in 2014 for over $2 million. And that wasn't all 40 acres. That was just about 32 acres or 34.
It's incredible, isn't it?
The original deed I gave her to scan. Uh-huh. So she has it, the original deed from, where he bought it.
What year did he buy it?
He bought it in 1943.
Okay. Now, did you have electricity on Old Alabama Road?
We didn't have when we first moved there, but we did get it I was probably 2 or 3 years. It was the Rural Electric, which was Marietta, Cobb County EMC.
Right, okay. And of course, I'm trying to think, I think it was about 38 that Cobb EMC started up, but not with a whole lot of customers to begin with. So right. I guess it takes a while to get out different parts of the county, didn't it?
Yes, and of course we were in South Cherokee, which meant we probably, didn't get it as fast as,
Sure.
as the others did.
So everybody along Old Alabama Road and Hunt Road got electricity at the same time?
I think most of them did. I don't remember. I was only about 7 or 8 years old, I think, when we got electricity. Right. So that was, we moved there in 43. Then my dad got called to the military.
Oh, World War II.
Yes. And he left, I don't remember what time he left, but my mother and I stayed with her mother and dad.
You were the only child?
I'm an only child.
Okay.
And
where did they live?
They lived, Well, as the crow flies, it was about probably a mile. But if you go round the road, it was probably about 3 miles.
Okay.
But my granddaddy Dupree owned 80 acres. And it joined my mom and dad's when they bought that land.
Now, were they in Cherokee or?
They were in Cherokee.
Okay.
And mother's oldest sister lived in the on the 40 acres because they built a house up there. There was a house built there, and they lived on the 40 acres until that joined my mom and dad's property. And then that property joined my granddaddy's property. And then his brother owned 40 acres that joined that property.
Wow.
So it was all the way through. Now, Cherokee County has bought, I believe, part of my granddaddy Dupree's place and my aunt's place, mother's oldest sister. And then they just bought that in 2014, I believe it was, they bought all of mother and daddy's property. And they bought mother's sister's property that joins my mom and dad. It was kind of like a family. My dad bought the land and because the guy would not sell it to her husband. He wouldn't sell it to anyone, I don't think, but my dad. And he bought the land and then sold it to them. And then across the road was 12 acres, and mother's baby sister bought that. They bought that and built a house there. That was Dunn's. My mother's baby sister married Ralph Dunn. That the Dunn's supermarket or Dunn's shopping center in Acworth. The one they have just demolished. And he passed away at 50 years old. Had a massive heart attack. Well, it was really bad, and he was in the hospital, and he was not able to do anything. So it got so much of his heart, took so much of his heart.
But you had a family complex.
Right.
When you
It
were
was just a
growing up.
family, and we built a house on the 40 acres, and then we have one son, and he built a house down, my dad had a lake, about a 4-acre lake, and he built a house right above the lake.
Now, did you say that Cherokee County has bought that property now?
Yes.
And what are they going to do with it?
Oh, they're already doing it. They're putting in, it's going to be an industrial. That's what they're making. From the corner of my granddaddy, where you turn to go to my granddad Dupree, whose name was Jesse James Dupree, they bought all the way on the frontage of Old Alabama Road, which is now just Alabama Road. And they bought all of that, and it's going all the way through, they're just doing all the way down, and they've bought other property on past where my mom and dad lived. Their property was. They didn't buy they had property on both sides of the road, and it was kind of split the way Mr. Priest gave the family. So there was only like about 3 or 5 acres on the other side.
Now, your grandfather Dupree was a farmer, and he had a dairy also.
No, he was just a farmer. He had cows, and he actually had not horses but mules that he plowed with. I mean, he actually, they were teamed up double, and he actually walked behind them and plowed all the time. He never had, I don't guess he ever had a driver's license because they didn't have to have any driver's license back in that day. But he had I believe it was a T-model. And he drove the T-model. And I remember seeing it in the old, what they called a car house. And that was there at that time. My mother and daddy worked at Coates and Clark for, I don't know how many years they worked there, but they worked at Coates and Clark in the beginning, and then they would come home, and there was bottom land with a creek, and they would farm that, corn and beans and things like that, and they had a garden. They put up a lot of food, you know. And my dad had, he bought he and Walter Cox, and I was about 15 years old. They bought a store. It would belong to Mr. McClure, a grocery store in Acworth, right above the Legion, where the Legion Theater was.
Okay.
And he opened it, and I don't know, they had it a couple of years, and then Ralph Dunn, that was his first store. He was a manager of a Red Dot in Smyrna, and he bought that store from my dad and Walter, and then that's where he started, in town, right on Main Street.
Right. Now, your grandfather Dupree, did he take his vegetables to a farmer's market, or where did he sell them?
He actually sold them up here up in Cartersville. He sold them in Cartersville, and back then they would take a truck, and his son-in-law drove the truck, and they would just pick all the vegetables fresh, and they would put them in there, and they would go through the different streets in Cartersville and sell the vegetables.
I see. Okay.
And then they sold milk and butter. You know, it was eggs, because they had all of these things that they could, you know, make a living with, you know, because they'd just come out of the Depression.
Sure. Now, your father was in World War II. What did he do?
Well, he actually was in, his first stop was in North Carolina, and it was
Fort Bragg?
Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and he found a room for my mother and me to come up there, and we moved up there for about 3 months. He had bleeding ulcers, and he had to be very careful with diet. And of course, when he went into the military, you know, they didn't, you know, they're not partial to anyone, you know. So the first thing you know, with all the rigorous training and whatever, he wound up with bleeding ulcers.
Right.
And they tried to do something with him, and they could not. So he was discharged. So he didn't really, we were going to stay there until he shipped out, because they were going to ship out as soon as they finished basic training. But
he didn't ship out.
He didn't ship out because they discharged him. They said, "White, you can't make it."
Okay. So when he came back home, is that when he went to work for Coates and Clark?
Yes, sir.
What did he do at Coates and Clark?
I really don't know. I mean, dolphin, I don't know if that's the correct word or not. That's what they used. And putting up, spinning, you know, whatever the threads, keeping them up. That's all I ever knew.
Right.
They had a company store at that time that people would buy their food there, and they had a mill village where most of the people in town worked there. The mill village is still there.
Right. Yeah. But you all didn't live in the mill village. You were on Old Alabama Road.
We lived out of town. It was only about 5 miles, 4 to 5 miles from where we lived into Acworth, into Coates and Clark.
Right. Now, how long did your mother work in the mill?
She worked until I started to school. Okay. And I started school, my birthday's in November, so therefore they would not let me start to school in September when school started. I had to wait until the next September to start. So I was almost 7 years old when I started.
What school did you go to?
Oak Grove.
Oak Grove, okay. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, they had 9 grades at Oak Grove. There weren't any middle schools. There were no high school. You know, they had a high school, but it was in Canton.
So is this a one-room school?
No. It had 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10. They had about 12 rooms.
Oh, did they?
Yeah, and an auditorium. They later, as things started getting. The population in Cherokee County started getting larger. They had to take the auditorium and put doors up, or it was actually a partition, and you could take it down so they could have plays. There's a picture of the stage curtain in my pictures that had all the staff at when my mother was in the cafeteria, in 1962, maybe 63. And it says, it has on the drapes that pulled, it said OG.
How long did she work in the cafeteria?
Well, she worked 2 different times. She started when I started to school. She started working there, and then she left. Then when our son started, she wanted to go back to school and go to the cafeteria, and she went to the cafeteria and worked again until they had an automobile accident on Bells Ferry Road, and she was hurt pretty badly in it, and she had to learn to walk again. So she just decided to retire. She was close to retirement, so I believe they froze her retirement until time for her.
Age.
Right.
How big was your house when you were growing up?
Well, when Mother and Daddy bought it, it was 3 rooms and a porch.
Okay.
And when Mother sold the house, they had added on. It's probably the oldest house in South Cherokee County that's actually livable. And they had about 11 rooms.
Is that right?
Yeah, you know, counting everything that, the breakfast nook, laundry room, and bathrooms. They put in all this stuff and built onto it. And it was, our son built a big room a great room, and took the other one down and built a great room, and had a fireplace in it, and had high cathedral ceilings, the high ceilings. So they had done a lot of improvement to the house.
That's great.
But there were no telephones, so there was a period of really nothing. I remember some guy on a Saturday night ran in. There was this huge ditch that you could have probably put this house in on just past our house, but it wasn't on our land. And the guy ran off in it, and he came to the house and a Saturday night about 10 o'clock, and he said, "Its little footsies are sticking straight up."
Wow.
So that was, you could hear people. There was a little bump there, and if they were going too fast, they could lose it and go in there.
Yeah. Wow. What was it like to get electricity? You remember?
Yeah, I remember. Yeah, it changed a lot of things. Mother had a wood stove, and it wasn't too long until she got an electric stove. And then, of course, the electricity, and then Daddy put in a pump in the well, which, that was, and got water in the house. That way you didn't have to take it out of the well, draw the water. And the first lights we had in the rooms were like lights that came down, so they were reachable, and they had a little chain, and they tied a little string on them, and some kind of twine or something, and you could pull the...
So everything's from the ceiling?
Everything was from the ceiling in the beginning, and then...
Some birds out there.
They're really hollering around now, but then later they were able, they put the plug-ins and whatever. But I worked at Eaton's department store after Philip came along, and I worked there until while he was small on Saturdays, and filled in during vacation. And then the first job I had, though, out of high school was I went to work at the Bank of Acworth.
Okay. Talk about that.
Well, it was quite an experience. I really enjoyed it. There were only Buck Pittner was president, Harold Harrison was vice president, and Eileen Henson worked in the bookkeeping, and I worked in bookkeeping.
Mm-hmm.
I only worked for like about 3 months while the girl was on maternity leave.
Uh-huh.
And then from there, I went to Acme Lumber Company as secretary to Mr. George McMillan.
Okay.
And I stayed there until Philip was born.
Mm-hmm. Any memories of George McMillan?
Oh yeah, he was the character. His pipe.
Mm-hmm.
He had that pipe, you know, and he would start a letter and then he'd have to break away and of course then you did shorthand, you know. Mm-hmm. And he'd have to break away and do something else. And then I also helped Mr. Charlie McMillan do payroll.
Uh-huh.
So it was, and I stayed there for probably a couple of years.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Tell me about Buck Pittner.
Oh, Buck was a character. He had a sense of humor. He would laugh and joke with you, and he would get kind of shaky over situations when people wanted money and didn't have any collateral, you know. Mm-hmm. George Wallace worked there. I'd forgotten about George Wallace. George was there when they waited on George to get there because he always got to the bank first. Mm-hmm. This wasn't my tenure there. This was later on that two guys robbed the bank. Mm. They made him open up, and they went in, and of course he could open the vault, and they robbed the place. Mm. So it was a big excitement in,
I guess so.
Yeah. And then I worked for a doctor. I worked for Dr. Bullard.
Talk about that.
That was more of an experience than anything, you know, because I had never been in the medical field before. Mm-hmm. I did insurance, front desk, and was trained to do some things in the back. Mm-hmm. So I really enjoyed that, you know.
Where was his office?
His office was on Main Street. It was at the traffic light. At that time, there was Haynes Grocery Store on the corner, just if you cross the traffic light. And, you know, I don't know what the name of that street is. You know, you kind of just know the streets and you know what they are. Mm-hmm. It goes around to the school. It may have been School Street, because it went on around to the school. When you cross the railroad tracks, it went through the traffic light and down by Allen's 5 and 10, and Haynes was on the left. And then then there was Lanier Jewelry, and then Dr. Bullard's office was there, and then there was a little cafeteria next door, and then Johnny Green's, the Green's 5 and Dime. Mm-hmm. And then you went on up to, I believe, Lemon Junior Autry, the attorney that Daddy used all the time, was there. And then Eaton's department store, and then Lacey's. And there was then Dr. Cobble's office. And at one time, the building on the corner was a post office. Mm. And then I believe the post office moved to the north end of town. Mm-hmm. And then it became a pool hall. Rabbit's Q Room, I believe is what it was called. Uh-huh. Yeah. And I remembered, there's one picture in there of a pretty good shot of the back, not of the soda fountain, at at the Lacey's drugstore. Uh-huh. My son's sitting there playing at one of the soda tables. Mm-hmm. He's playing with a car or something. He had something playing with it. That one, and then they've moved it now, but it stayed there for many years. And then Acworth Pharmacy was in the middle of town, where there was a pool room came in there after they left, and then on to they went on to the north end of town. Acworth Pharmacy did.
Right. Dr. Bullard, a general practitioner?
Yes, he was a general practitioner.
And what did you do for him?
I worked at the front. I made appointments, and then I also, after a while, started doing the insurance. And also, if they got behind, then I was trained for the back to take patients back and do vitals. And I could do lab work, some lab work, and make X-rays.
Okay. Now, did you move into Acworth while you were working?
No. Stayed. We lived there for. We built our house on 40 acres in 1959, 58, 59.
And you've been there ever since?
No, we actually renovated the house because we wanted to go over on the other property on toward the lake and build. And since I was an only child, I knew I'd have to take care of Mother and Dad. So we wanted them to go over and build a house, smaller too. And my mom said, your dad won't go, and Dad said, your mom won't go. So, it was kind of a joint venture. And so we just totally renovated the house. I mean, moved the driveway and everything. So we stayed there from 1950, actually 58 we built the house. And we stayed there until we moved to the North Georgia Mountains in 1998.
Okay.
And then we came back 2 years ago. And we're not there. We're not in Acworth. We're in Cartersville.
Okay.
Because we couldn't find anything that,
Things are expensive right here.
Yeah, they're expensive. They're expensive up in Bartow County too. But it was my childhood was great living on a farm. I think that so many children now are missing out on a lot of things because they don't know what farm life is, and maybe they don't want to know, but because they're raised in town. Of course, as I was growing up, we would come to town, and the streets were just this line because people would just pull in there and park and watch the people and see. Everybody knew everyone knew everyone back then.
So coming to town was coming to Acworth?
Right. And you would come to pick up some groceries or maybe to shop at Eaton's and
would you come in on Saturdays or come in?
Yes, mostly on Saturdays, and that's when the people came in, especially the people who farmed. And they would, come in, and there would be, sometimes there wouldn't be a place to park on that because it was only one side, and the depot was on the other side. So, but I've seen a lot of changes take place in Acworth.
Well, I was going to ask you about that. How has it changed?
Well, it's just grown up so, and there's so many people, and there's so many more houses now and subdivisions that, and people visited back then. People would come on a Sunday and spend the day with people. They'd have what they call dinner, lunch. And spend the day and go home 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And now they don't do that. People just don't do that. They don't have time. But there was a little courthouse on Old Alabama Road, a little one-room courthouse. I don't know what kind of cases. I don't know.
JP court?
Well, it may have been just a JP court. I was only about 5, maybe 6 years old, but they voted there also.
Oh, okay.
And my dad, I would go with my dad when he voted. I would go up there when he voted. So they still vote at the school at Oak Grove. They do not have school on that day, and they vote.
What did you do for recreation, for fun, when you were growing up?
Well, you really didn't have that much, because the houses weren't close together to have someone to play with or, do anything with. And you just kind of made your own. I rode my little tricycle all around, and at school we played ball. We had basketball. They had a basketball court outside. We played basketball, and we had a softball team. It was just a team within the school, Oak Grove School. But you graduated from the 7th grade to the 9th grade, 7th grade to the 8th grade, and then it would be, I guess, where they have, I'm out of the schoolroom. I have no grandchildren, so I really don't know. It was grammar school or elementary school, and then it goes to middle school and then to high school, right? That I guess it would have been, Oak Grove was a middle school and a grammar school.
First 7 grades or first 8 grades?
It had 7 grades, and then it had an 8th and 9th grade.
Oh.
It had an 8th and 9th grade. Our class was supposed to be the last class that graduated from Oak Grove. And then we were supposed to go to Cherokee High. They did not get it completed. So
Cherokee
High. So the bus brought us to Acworth High School.
So you graduated from Acworth?
I did. There were a lot of us that after going there a year, we didn't want to change again. So we just carpooled.
So what year did you graduate?
1958.
Okay. What was it like at Acworth High School?
Well, it was different from what I had, where I'd been. And of course, we walked into a school that we didn't know anyone. We didn't start grammar school there or elementary school. We didn't start school there. We went to another school. And of course, our class, some of the people we had gone to school with were there. But sometimes they had different classes. I had Mr. T.C. Cantrell was principal. And Mr. T.C. taught bookkeeping. And I wanted to be a teacher, but when I found out I had to take biology and chemistry and dissect frogs, I'm going, no way. So I decided to go another route. And so I took bookkeeping. I'd had 1 year of algebra, and I took bookkeeping, and I didn't like it, because we had to keep a set of books for 6 weeks. And I went to Mr. Cantrell and I said, please let me change and just take civics, because it was just a half course. I said, let me take civics. And he goes, no, ma'am. And I said, but Mr. Cantrell, I don't like it. And he goes, well, that's too bad. You can either sink or swim. And he would not let me switch. But I married in December, and before I graduated the next June. There were 3 or 4 girls that had married in there. But Mr. Cantrell, there was, in my study hall, Mr. Cantrell, there was an announcement came over the PA system that said, Marie White, come to the office. And I think, holy cow, what have I done? And Mr. Cantrell had a long talk with me about, he had heard we were getting married at Thanksgiving. And I said, no, sir, not getting married at Thanksgiving. He goes, because I want you to go to college. And I said, okay. I said, but I'm not getting married at Thanksgiving. So I didn't tell him Christmas, but he didn't say anything to me. He didn't say anything because there were about 3 other girls that had married. So that kind of, and there were some more girls that married, and of course he took us out of PE and Beta Club and all the clubs we were in. He took us out of all that.
Because you were married.
And I can understand PE, but I didn't understand the Beta Club. We had worked for that, but he took us out and wouldn't let us graduate with, showing that we were in Beta Club. The beach was a big thing in Acworth, and I think it probably opened about 1954.
Well, early 50s.
Yeah, it was in the early 50s, and we would go down. You could drive through Acworth, and that was a big thing on the weekends to go to the beach. And it was bumper to bumper all the way. I mean, from in town in Acworth, Main Street, all the way down through, all the way to the beach, up Seminole Drive. And then, of course, Seminole Drive had a dentist, Dr. Reed. He was the only dentist, I believe, at that time. He was in a house on Seminole Drive. And he was there for many years. And then the Harrisons lived. Mr. Harrison, that was, I believe he was president of the Cobb Exchange Bank, which at that time may have been just in Marietta. So, but the beach was a big thing in the beach house, and they had sock hops and dances and whatever there. And, you know, just
so
teenagers.
You went to sock hops?
No, I never went to any of them.
Oh, okay.
You know, my mother and dad were very strict on me because I was an only child. And they, you know, they...
So what was Dewey doing when you met him? Was he still in school? Or was
no, he was already out of school. He was working. Actually, we had a play in the 9th grade, and it was a school play at the end of the year, and it was called Mary and Margaret.
Mary and Margaret.
Mary and Margaret. And I was Margaret, the old maid.
Okay.
And he and a friend of his came to see that play. And it was in June 1955. And actually May. I'm sorry, it was May. And our first date was June the 5th, 1955. And we dated for about 2.5 years and married. Been married 60 years.
How about that? From 58 to 2018?
We'll be, yeah.
Well, that's remarkable.
Well, we married in 57. So we were married 60 years in December.
Okay.
And we'll be married 61 if we...
In December.
In December.
Okay.
But, you know, Acworth was a great town to grow up in. I mean, it was a small town, and you walk down the street or go to the grocery store and you ran into all these people to talk to. There was actually Battles, I believe, no, Harrisons. The two there were initials, and I don't remember the initials, but there were two brothers that had the Harrisons, and then Battles bought them out, and I think it stayed Battles for years. Yeah.
So you thought you were part of Acworth, even though you were in Oak Grove? Right.
And we had, like I said, we had an Acworth address, but we were in South Cherokee County, and our county seat was in Canton.
Right.
So, but we were, you know, there was really, I don't remember any crime or any bad things happening. There were some. I've seen some on Facebook about the guys playing pranks and doing things, you know, but not any violence or anything to that effect. Maybe occasionally, but it probably wouldn't have been over 5 or 6 in a whole year.
Right. What do you think when you come to Acworth today?
Well, there's a lot of changes, you know, and had I stayed away the entire 18 years, I don't think I could have even gotten through Acworth because there were so many changes. And I see where Greens is something else, and then there's sandwich shops, and there's Henry's and the Allens, and there, I don't know what's on down back of it. I haven't been through there that much, but there was a fabric store down below Allen's, in back of Allen's, across from the bank, and the hardware store was down there. And City Hall was in back there too. Pace Yarborough was with the fire department, and I think he did something with the city. They kind of doubled. So, but as we would come to town, I would see all these houses before you got to the old hotel that has since gone. And I'd think, oh, wouldn't it be neat to live in one of those houses and you could just walk to town?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I'm about out of questions. Anything we should have talked about that we haven't that you'd like to add to the interview?
Well, I don't think there's anything. I mean, I think most of Acworth's been covered real well by a lot of people that lived here. It was just a great little town to grow up in. I guess I would say I miss that little town. I'm glad of all the new places and new things and what they're doing with the Save the Acworth history. I think that's really great. And Mac, has wanted to do this. He wanted the depot, but it didn't work out. But, then he did this. And so I think Mac's been instrumental in that. Mm-hmm. But Dewey managed Altoona Landing for 30 years.
He did?
Mm-hmm. You know where Altoona Landing is? It's crossing the lake. It's going toward Cartersville on the old 4-lane on 141.
And he managed it?
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
They had a beach, a campground. They did boats, so painted boats, and
sure.
They had. I think when he went there to work, he was probably. I've heard him say how many boats they had. It was very few, and when they left, I think they had like 1,000.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Wow.
So it's now owned by some company, I think, in California. They own several marinas. Mm-hmm. But Altoona Landing was, it really grew, and there were a lot of people that had cabins down there. Mm-hmm. So
you didn't get too far away from the lake then, I guess.
Well, we spent a lot of time down there, and of course, people will say, well, why don't you get a boat and get back on the land and get back on the water? And he goes, that's the last thing I want. I spent 30 years on the water. But I appreciate the opportunity to do this.
Well, thank you very much.